good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. My name is Lorenzo Guadagno, and I work with the International Organization for Migration and issues related to human mobility and disasters. And I am honored to chair today this webinar. This webinar is part of the GP20 initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative that was launched for the 20th anniversary of the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, and aims to bring attention to the issue of internal displacement again and strengthen collaboration to prevent, address, and resolve the issue in countries coping with internal displacement. This is the third webinar in a series of GP20 webinars that took place this year. The first one focused on durable solution to internal displacement situation in the Horn of Africa, and the second on IDP women and girls' participation in humanitarian settings. And the idea of these webinars is basically to share field practices that have proved successful among practitioners. So today's webinar is focusing specifically on displacement in the context of disaster and climate change, or for short, disaster displacement. You might know that this issue has come really to relevance in the public debate and in the policy and implementation spheres as of late. You probably know or have heard of the numbers that fly around on this topic. We are talking about probably around 18 million new displaced in 2018, according to the numbers that are provided, the estimates that are provided by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and an average of over 26 million people displaced every year since 2008. And this goes really from the disaster risk reduction point of view as a distinct relevance, because the way people are displaced and their mobility they experience in the context of disasters and climate change shapes the way they are affected by this phenomena. This displacement amplifies and extends the impacts that people suffer in disasters, and especially when it is not adequately managed, planned for, it has a cost on displaced persons and their host communities in terms of reduced access to assistance, reduced access to essential services, disruption of livelihoods, family separation, protection risks, etc. And it ultimately leads to impoverishment, hinders recovery, and has serious implication on the stability and the cohesion of affected communities. Therefore, it is really important to highlight disaster risk reduction measures that can help address these challenges at all levels. So at national level for governments, at local level for authorities and actors that are working in addressing situations of displacement, preparing for them and preventing them, as well as at international level for us actors that work both at the policy and the operational level internationally. This webinar in particular will be an opportunity to learn about DRR, disaster risk reduction, and how it can be put into practice through policies and operations that help address the risks posed by displacement and the risk of displacement itself. We will have a series of presentations which will try to address mainly two questions. So the first one being, how can governments be supported in including necessary provisions on disaster displacement in their countries or regions, disaster risk reduction strategy and planning? And the second one, what are some examples of local, community-based disaster risk reduction measures that build resilience and reduce the risk of displacement for the most vulnerable? And what can we learn from them? So we have a number of speakers that are joining us today. Some are in the room with me and others will be connecting remotely. We will start with a presentation by Nina Birkeland, who is the Senior Advisor on Disaster Displacement and Climate Change for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Geneva. Then we'll have Anne Brewer, who is the Executive Manager of Disaster Management Legislation, Policy and Compliance Management at NDMC in South Africa. Then we'll have Achala Navaratne, who is the Head of Delegation for the American Red Cross in Bangladesh and is working in Cox's Bazar, implementing disaster risk reduction in the camps. We will have then a Q&A session to go then into concluding remarks by Atle Solberg, who is joining us from the Secretariat of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. I will ask all the speakers to be brief in order to leave as much time as possible for the Q&A. Just as a technicality for the Q&A, please write your question and submit it through the WebEx chat. Identify yourself, if possible, and your organization, and specify, if that's the case, to whom the question or comment is addressed. So we'll try as much as possible, again, to leave time for sharing concrete examples and good practices. So do not hesitate to share your practices from the field if you are in the audience and have anything to contribute. The webinar will be recorded, and we will share the presentations and the audio file. So before we go in the first presentation with Nina, I will just highlight the relevance that the issue of displacement has gained in terms of international policy, and in particular for the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, which is basically the framework document for all the disaster risk reduction efforts of all actors at global level. And compared especially to its predecessor, the Hyogo framework for action, the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction really points to a number of issues that give a very nuanced approach to the issue of displacement and what disaster risk reduction efforts, which disaster risk reduction efforts need to be put in place in order to address its consequences and prevent it. Firstly, displacement is highlighted as one of the key impacts of disasters, and as one of the key elements that need to be reduced in order to achieve the global target B of the Sendai framework, which aims to reduce the number of people affected by disasters. In order to do so, the Sendai frameworks highlight that it's relevant to promote preparedness and responses that effectively reduce risks linked with displacement, so evacuation drills, area-based support systems, and systems to allow people to evacuate safely and to safe places, so that the disaster management actors have systems in place to actually be able to manage displacement in case it happens. The Sendai framework also highlights specifically the relevance of addressing disaster displacement and its consequences as a precondition for effective recovery, and in particular how post-disaster reconstruction efforts should look at addressing the situation of temporary settlements for those who have been displaced by disasters. And we'll hear more from a similar case from Cox's Bazar in a way. And then the Sendai framework also highlights that one needs to develop policies and programs to address disaster-induced human mobility that take into account the need to build the resilience of the people that have been affected by disasters and have been displaced in the process and their host communities. So having a comprehensive approach that looks at all the consequences of displacement for those directly affected and indirectly affected. Specific attention is also given to the issue of cross-border displacement, in particular through transboundary cooperation that enables better policy and planning and implementation of measures that can help prevent and address the issue. And more in general, through the all of society approach that the Sendai framework really promotes, the need to include migrants and displaced persons in the implementation and design of disaster risk reduction interventions. So, of course, it's a very nuanced approach. As I say, it's complex. And in order to really give tools and guidance on how to implement all these interventions, a group of actors under the guidance of UNDRR over the last years have started developing a Words into Action tool, which is basically a practical guidance on how to concretely implement the provisions of the Sendai framework. And on this, I would like to ask our first presenter, Nina Birkeland, to provide us with more information on the process maybe that's led to this document, to this guidance document, and what's in it, and how it can be used from all disaster risk reduction actors to reduce the risks linked with this displacement. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for this introduction. And I think it sets a very good stage for why we as NRC, but together with very many UNHCR, IOM, UNDR, Platform on Disaster Displacement, IDMC, the Germans and several others saw that after we got the Sendai framework in place, where we have so many references to people on the move because of disasters, whether people are fleeing or also moving more voluntary, we needed to help governments in particular who has the responsibility to think about how can we include displacement in our national DRR strategies. I think for us, coming from a humanitarian development organization, we very often jump to the conclusion, let's make a new strategy for displacement and policy and get the governments to implement this. But I think we have realized in a lot of the policy work we have done is that many governments have too many policies they're trying to implement, so why not rather try to include issues that are key and maybe missing into existing frameworks. So this is very much why we then look to how, with all the hooks that we have in the Sendai framework, how can we try to come up with some guidance that can make sure that when governments are looking at their strategies, they also can look at displacement. And I think what is very important here, and as Lorenzo said, this is not just about helping people when they are displaced, but very much about preventing it from happening and trying to reduce the number of people being displaced. So in our guide, which those who have access to the slides can see, we called it Disaster Displacement, How to Reduce Risk, Address Impacts and Strengthen Resilience. And I will go quickly through the next two slides since Lorenzo already covered several of these issues, but within the Sendai framework, there are 2 of the 5 targets that really are key when we talk about displacement. One is target B, which talks about reduce the number of affected people by 2030. You will see that we don't have the word displaced people here, but affected people includes displaced people. And when we look at this, there's many ways that can be done. We can look at reducing the risk of displacement, and you can do that through development of policies and programs that includes human mobility, and there's several other ways. Target E in the Sendai framework is maybe even more concrete because that is about how we can integrate the displacement in the national DRR strategies. And I know Arne, who will come after me, will speak much more about how this is done concretely in one country. But from the global perspective, several organizations came together and with the support and the kind of lead from both UNDRR, but also the Platform on Disaster Displacement, we put together this guide that we are presenting here today. This guide on disaster displacement is part of a series that the UNDRR has developed to help implementation of the Sendai framework. There are several others and several other issues, but I think ours is maybe the one that's maybe most specialized on one specific issue. And we try to structure the guide around 4 lines. One is addressing displacement, the way that it's presented and referred to in the Sendai framework. We have tried to include examples from countries. We would be very happy to have many more examples shared. And what UNDRR is putting up now and should be online early next year is a new part of their web pages where these kind of good or practices examples, but also where it did not work, can be shared amongst people who want to develop policies and practices. We also try to make sure that this guide can be used in the regional fora, so it's not just individual countries, but also with a regional approach. And in the annexes, we have included a lot of other references for those who want to go deeper. The whole guide is structured very much around how do we deal with this, and thinking that the first step we need to take is always to avoid displacement and strengthen resilience of people. The next step would be to prepare for the unavoidable, because we do know that the natural hazards occurred. We do know that disaster displacement will happen despite all efforts to try to reduce it. There will still be some. Then we also need to think about the third step, which is how do we respond? And fourth, also then how do you support both the displaced people, but also the host populations during displacement? Then finding durable solutions to the displacement situation, and then assess and start the cycle over again. With this guide in place, we hope that this is one step that can help and support governments in including disaster displacement. And we have now, in the last few months, worked both with South Africa and Nepal. We have worked with the 4 Andean countries on a regional level. And we will hopefully then in 2020 be able to work with 2, 3, 4 more countries or regions with some new funding we gotten from Germany. And the way that we try to do this work is very much making sure that within the government there's an interest to address these issues. And then we have people, both global experts, but as much through our networks, finding people in each country that could help and support that this is happening. So bringing experience from other locations, be extra legs and hands in the thinking, but also have access maybe to what has been done in other countries, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time someone wants to draft and work on policy. Again, this is what we really want to make sure that within the UNDR web pages, these learnings and experiences are available so we can all use them. One thing we are developing and finalizing as we speak is a companion checklist that will follow this document. And that checklist is really a short, brief document. So really starting with a checklist to see, have we done this and this in our national policies or regional policies? And if not, what should we do? And then you can go to the bigger guide. So this companion checklist will be available in the first quarter of 2020. And as the same as the words into action document, both in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. We know that in Nepal, for example, they've already translated it into Nepali, and we hope that more governments also will translate at least the checklist, but also maybe the big document into national languages that are relevant for them. I think I'll stop there and then rather come back when people have questions or comments. So thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Thanks a lot. And so this, after we gave a little bit of the global picture, I think it's time to move at the country, at the local level. And I would invite our second speaker, Anne Brewer, from South Africa, to actually provide a perspective on how these document or relevant measures have been implemented at the national level in the country. Knowing that the whole Southern Africa Development Cooperation region is really active on this topic, and Southern Africa is an excellent example of the work that has been done on this. So, Anne, you have the floor if you're connected. Anne, can you please confirm that you're connected? Are you experiencing difficulties? You can let us know through the chat. So we do know that in addition to Anne, Benedetta Gualandi, who works with Oxfam and works closely with the government, should be online. Maybe we could ask Benedetta whether she is online at this. Yeah.
I think, can you hear me now?
Perfect. We can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Sorry
about that. Thank you very much. Yes, this is Anne Brewer from South Africa. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity, and we would like to extend our appreciation to the platform on disaster displacement for this opportunity to participate in the webinar as part of the GP20 initiative, which actually aims to bring much needed attention to the issue of internal displacement and strengthen collaboration to address the issue. As you all know, amongst other things, the Sendai framework highlights the development of public policies on the relocation of human settlements in disaster risk-prone zones as a potential preventative or adaptive measure, and also recognizes the need to find durable solutions in the post-disaster phase, as well as empowering and assisting people disproportionately affected by disasters. More broadly, it encourages the adoption of policies and programs addressing disaster-induced human mobility to strengthen the resilience of affected people and that of host communities. So coming to South Africa, the South African Disaster Management Act, as well as the National Disaster Management Framework that we have, give priority to the developmental measures that reduce the vulnerability of disaster-prone areas, communities, and households, and they emphasize that disaster risk reduction concepts of disaster prevention and mitigation are the core principles to guide disaster management in South Africa. So the implementation of these two principles will eventually reduce disaster impacts. And one of the most common impacts of disasters is also around displacement. Our Disaster Management Act and framework explicitly mandate the evacuation of people and the provision of shelter at all spheres of government, that is the national, provincial, as well as the most local levels. Our framework also stipulates the risk assessment of homes and dwellings for disaster risk reduction and development planning. In addition, the framework is also explicit on the protection of priority populations, all of which would be at greater risk of disaster displacement. These include communities in areas exposed to extreme weather and other natural and technological hazards, and which are therefore likely to sustain serious human and property losses in the event of a disaster. But it also emphasizes the poor and underserviced rural and urban communities, including informal settlements, especially those located in fragile ecological areas that sustain repeated losses from recurrent small, medium, and large disaster events, and that lack insurance coverage to facilitate recovery. That we often see in the current conditions that we face of climate variability and an increase in smaller but more intense events. It is also emphasizing highly vulnerable households in at-risk areas with limited capacity to resist or recover from external shocks, particularly child-headed households, or those headed by the elderly, or households affected by chronic illness. So with the support provided by the Norwegian Refugee Council and Oxfam as members of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and through the financial contribution of the government of Germany, South Africa has embarked on a process to develop internal disaster displacement guidelines, which will form part of a suite of guidelines that the National Disaster Management Center is developing to support the implementation of our legislation. So we are really trying to customize the words into action into a national program. So South Africa's interest to participate in this global program is particularly around strengthening our policy, using the Words into Action guide as the basis for practical measures to reduce and manage displacement risk in the country. Currently an action plan has been proposed, which also identifies key areas that should be explored, taking as point of reference the published guideline of the Words into Action. And then the current reality in South Africa is that we are increasingly challenged by displacement risk. Municipalities, which is our local authority closest to the people, are usually first in line to respond to displacement events and approaches in dealing with it. And these, the approaches, I mean, is not consistent. South Africa is already experiencing significant effects of climate change, as evidenced through increased temperatures and climate variability. This manifests through a wide range of hazards, including drought, fires, floods, cyclones, and severe storms that often trigger widespread hardship and devastation, which threaten livelihoods, increase vulnerability, and undermine hard-earned development gains. South Africa has, over the past 4 years, been battling against the effects of the worst drought recorded since 1926. We are also currently dealing with the consequences of devastating flash floods that affected communities in the past week. And we had several meetings this week dealing with almost the extremes of drought and floods at the same time. Displacement under such conditions is one of the most common impacts that need to be dealt with in the immediate aftermath of these emergencies or disasters. And we have seen in this week's floods in our urban communities that is really a direct result of people living in areas that are not safe and are unsuitable for structures to be, where they live on the banks of rivers where it is very vulnerable to the climate variability. So displacement occurs in a broader environmental and socio-economic context, impacted by inequality, poverty, violence, and governance challenges. Forced human mobility is therefore complex, and if not managed effectively, can also be a driver of other risks, including safety and security risks. Many urban municipalities in South Africa have experienced challenges in managing this displacement immediately after a disaster. And we have seen it once again this week when people are reluctant to leave their homes that are unsafe. They are scared of the security implications. They don't want to lose all their possessions. And it's very inconvenient. In terms of work and getting started again after the devastation. Displaced people tend to move to other poorly planned, underserved, and already overcrowded informal settlements, which are often located in risk-prone areas vulnerable to the negative effects of climate. Displaced people often become urban dwellers in self-built and substandard houses near noxious industries, sewage farms, or landfill within floodplains, which greatly increases their vulnerability. So not only does South Africa have its own disaster displacement risk to manage, as a regional leader, it also lends support in disaster response. Earlier this year, the tropical cyclones Idai and Kenneth have tested South African capacities to support its neighbors in need, including thousands of displaced people. It would also behove South Africa to lead the region in the harmonization of disaster displacement policy and practice, such as interoperable early warning systems and cross-border simulation exercises. Recent displacement events in the country and region have highlighted the need for efficient and uniform approaches to manage displacement. So although South African legislation, regulations, and policies already address many of the issues recommended in the Words into Action Guide to reduce and manage displacement risk, it remains fragmented, and there is not a single consolidated policy that brings all of it together. The various provinces and municipalities have different approaches in managing disaster impacts, including that of displacement. There are disparities among the provinces, for instance, in their practice and capacity to prevent displacement and to effectively respond to the displacement through various levels of contingency planning, the management of evacuations and provision of support to displaced people in finding a durable solution. So we acknowledge that we need policy uniformity regarding displacement across the country. The need for minimum standards in providing temporary shelter was also identified to ensure protection of the constitutional rights and humane treatment of all internally displaced persons within the country in providing humanitarian relief. So we are encouraged by the approach taken by the NRC in support of the efforts of the platform on disaster displacement to incorporate disaster displacement risk as a focus area within future disaster risk reduction strategies. We are also excited to utilize this opportunity, which is almost like a pilot opportunity for us, to identify good practices that exist at local level across South Africa, which could be documented and shared eventually. We believe that the development of displacement guidelines to be used across the spheres of government in South Africa will complement our existing processes of developing various guidelines on disaster management. We are also embarking on a process to review our national disaster management framework, or that is also regarded as our strategy, to align our efforts with the Sendai framework, and in particular also to meet target E, to substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. So this will also be an opportunity to integrate disaster displacement as a specific focus area of our DRR strategy. The National Disaster Management Centre in South Africa is the focal point for the process to unfold. Unfortunately, we have not been able to make progress as envisioned initially, as we had to deal with quite a number of competing priorities and country processes simultaneously. However, we have embarked on the process and already determined the scope of the guidelines to fit into our existing processes. So in terms of the national guidelines that will be developed, it will address in-country or internal disaster displacement based on disaster risks identified in one of our earlier guidelines that we have developed on conducting comprehensive disaster risk assessments. And displacement associated with disasters in the South African context is then defined as displacement resulting from an event classified as a disaster by the National Disaster Management Centre. This is to bring it in line with our legislation and to contain the scope in terms of the development of the national guideline. It will at this stage not address cross-border displacement or displacement associated with security, war, conflict. It will basically be contained within the disaster risk reduction and disaster context. So eventually the guidelines will serve as a one-stop shop, gathering existing regulations and filling the gaps. So in conclusion, our joint efforts and the development of national guidelines for South Africa need to be towards ensuring coherence across disaster risk reduction strategies and the implementation of integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effects of disasters. So basically, that is what we currently have in South Africa, and we are really looking forward to the end result of this process, where we will have national guidelines in place, but also capacitating people to implement the guidelines and eventually make a difference in terms of reducing the impact of disaster displacement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Brewer, for your intervention and for this illustration of how the process of actually implementing the relevant provision of the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction through the Words into Action guideline can actually be put into practice, really. To me, it was really interesting to see how comprehensive the interventions that you're looking at really are. Spanning from interventions that are aiming to prevent displacement, to prepare for it, to address the needs of the people displaced, but also their longer-term, to find longer-term solutions to their situation. The focus indeed on coherence and predictable responses across level is really interesting. We will hear now from a local level example, but indeed having a solid framework at national level for operating on this issue is essential, as you said, for having predictability and coherence in responses to this issue. We'll try to move now to the next presentation, knowing that our next speaker is having a little bit of trouble connecting, apparently. And we are going to move to Bangladesh, to Cox's Bazar, where displaced persons, so people that came in, refugees, and people that settled into the camps over the last year, are facing disaster risk scenario. Basically, they moved into high-risk areas, which is, as has been highlighted for the case of South Africa as well, something relatively common. So it is not only from a disaster risk reduction point of view a question of addressing the risks that are linked directly with the direct impacts of disaster through displacement, but also to understand that displacement can create further disaster risk, and that we as disaster risk reduction actors need to account specifically for the situation of displaced persons in our planning and implementation. I would then give the floor to Ms. Achala Navaratne. You have the floor if you are connected. You are online, please.
So I hope we can hear.
We can hear you perfectly. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Sorry for the connection difficulties. Thanks for the opportunity to join this discussion, and specifically on the invitation from the Platform for Disaster Displacement. This is, I'm going to try to keep it short in case I cut off. Just to highlight, this is a kind of a case study from Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, where already displaced population is living in a city like environment within the camp settlements of Cox's Bazar. Overall displaced population is close to 900,000 people. However, if you take some of the mega camp settlements areas, it comes up to about 700,000 people, which is almost a huge city in terms. So I'm not going to talk about. There are a lot of displacement aspects in disaster displacement aspects in Bangladesh, but I'm going to stick to more on the. Can you hear me?
Now it's better.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to stick to the conversation more on the disaster displacement aspects within the camp settlements, which we see as almost an informal city, and the displacement that happens, how to reduce that through the disaster risk reduction and preparedness efforts. So to go to the next slide, I think what I would like to focus on is, once most of these people who were displaced from the Rakhine state of Myanmar, when they moved to Bangladesh, most of them were living in a very disaster-prone area, specifically from a cyclone perspective, because cyclones do impact Bangladesh almost every year, or sometimes more than multiple times during a year. But in the initial phases, mainly after the 2017 main influx of people, the focus was mostly on the emergency needs. But during the early stages of 2018, as the camp settlements started getting more organized, we realized the main aspects that we needed to focus on were disaster risk reduction and preparedness efforts. to reduce further displacements within the camp settlements, both possibly to additional host community areas or within the camp settlements. So that's the focus we had, and as part of that, one of the key things that the government of Bangladesh was able to do was to expand its some of its national disaster management systems, specifically the cyclone preparedness program. This cyclone preparedness program, which is a national program that is expanded across the coastal districts of Bangladesh, was expanded into the camp settlements, mainly to ensure, in case of a major disaster, that that casualties are reduced, as well as further displacement does not take place from the areas where the refugees are located. The approach was to make sure that this population was ready, prepared, trained, and were taking care of their own self resilience in a certain sense, to build the social self-resilience through engagement of this population in the preparedness efforts. In addition, a lot of work was done through the site management sector and the site management partners in improving the conditions in the camp through site planning, site development, embankment protection, heavy infrastructure. But as a multitude of partners, we were able to focus on the soft aspects, which is mostly the community organizing, training, and empowerment of this community, and at the same time planning from a more city planning perspective or neighborhood planning, neighborhood development approach. If we can go to the next slide. Hi, Lorenzo.
Yeah, we can hear you again.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm not sure when I'm cut off and not, so apologies for this.
Just a slide.
Yes, so to focus on the early warning and early action aspects, mainly from a preparedness perspective, the national early warning system was expanded, and these the refugees were given what we call the CPP volunteer status, and then more than 100 volunteers per camp were trained by a multitude of partners, led by the Cyclone Preparedness Program of the Ministry of Disaster Management of Bangladesh, supported by the Bangladesh Red Crescent and the Red Cross Red Crescent, as well as UNHCR, IOM, UNDP, and the site management partners. So the focus was, again, to make sure that this, whenever there are issues of disasters, it doesn't have to be a cyclone, in a multi-hazard approach, whether it's a landslide, whether it's a fire, these communities are able to respond and be the first responders, and also reduce possibilities for further displacement in the camps. So in the sense of a planning perspective, it's when the cyclone preparedness program was extended, it is not the cyclone preparedness program alone that is extended. That's the national disaster management systems that are getting extended. What has happened is, after these volunteers from the refugee community have been trained, disaster management units in each of these camps. And what will happen now next, in the next phase, is this, similar to the national system, these bodies will be managed through a disaster management committee perspective, which will then bring a certain level of governance aspect to the disaster management in the camps. So this is the mostly the structural and a macro level activities that have happened. And this has been going on for the last 2 years, where the refugees have been trained, refugees are responding to small-scale disasters as well as other disasters. And then on top of this, there are a number of hardware activities that are ongoing through the UNHCR, IOM, WFP, the site management improvement engineering project, as well as other kind of FAO and others doing more green infrastructure. So it's not just the concrete and the hard infrastructure that we are looking at, but how to do the embankment protection in a in an environmental friendly manner, in the sense so that it also provides embankment protection, but also provides greenery, because a lot of these areas do not have the soil protection aspect because it's exposed. So it's a wide range of disaster risk reduction measures that are taken by a multitude of partners, and that's the kind of overall aspects that we are looking at to reduce the disaster displacement within this city, because if not, we could have a displacement within from camp to camp, where in a very congested area, it's very difficult to find space for some of the displaced populations. And in addition, if there is a large-scale disaster like a cyclone, this could result in further displacement of these communities to the host communities that could create further tension between the host communities and the guest communities. So that's the kind of the broader picture in Cox's Bazar, where the multi-agency approach of working together with the under the guidance of the Ministry of Disaster Management and the government's administrative system in the camps, with the UN and the other agencies and the Red Cross, Red Crescent. What I want to highlight from a last future perspective is, again, ultimately, if we are going to reduce displacement in this city, it has to be looked at from a urban planning, site development, and a neighborhood development approach, and to look at more durable solutions, which at this point we find a little bit difficult to do based on the current conditions that are prevailing. But we hope that we will be able to do so and reduce the risks further in these camp settlements as it becomes, as this informal city becomes a almost a formal city with a formal administrative system and durable solutions coming into this camp settlement. With that, I'll stop. I hope I haven't dropped off.
No, it was perfect. Thank you very much. And despite the challenging connection, I think the information came relatively clearly for us as well. So I really appreciated the way you highlighted the fact that a humanitarian intervention in this situation necessarily transition towards development consideration, towards disaster risk reduction, preparedness, prevention, and also, as you mentioned in your conclusion, the urban planning aspect of this. So obviously, like the finding solution aspects to hold these, it goes well beyond just meeting people's immediate needs, and it's really linked with longer-term development considerations for the displaced persons and the host community, and how this variety of interventions that you were mentioning, the soft elements of disaster risk reduction, the hard elements, really need to be integrated in a scenario where there are still acute humanitarian needs that need to be addressed as well. I think we have heard again from the policy perspective how the process of integrating displacement into disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction works. We have heard from the field in terms of how working with displaced persons to do disaster risk reduction can be put into practice. And now we would like to open the floor for a Q&A session. We have about half an hour. We would invite everyone again to submit questions through the WebEx chat, but also, I mean, if you do have any experience that you would like to share with the rest of the attendees to this webinar, then do not hesitate to do so. We can also share more information about, in particular, this last case. Angela has been kind enough to share with us a compiled version of the information on this case study, which we will include in the documents that can be shared through WebEx for the participants, and as well as the presentation, I'm assuming. Yeah, perfect. So if you do have questions, please use the chat function in the interface to submit it. And since there is nobody who is submitting questions yet, if Ms. Brewer is still on the line, I would like to ask her to expand a little bit on something she said. She mentioned the fact that they are developing an action plan with key areas to explore. And I thought it would be interesting to hear about what these priority areas that they've identified might be. And we know that Ms. Brewer possibly had to leave. So if Benedetta from Oxfam is online, maybe you can take this question instead. So if they're not online anymore, maybe could I ask then speakers, so either Nina, who has participated, I'm assuming also in the implementation part of the document, or Achala, what are their main lessons learned from this process?
I can go first, Nina, here. I think one of the lessons we see very clearly in South Africa, I mean, they're still in the process, but what they've been very eager to, and we will do together next year, is to not only work on the national level, but work on the provincial level. As Anna said in her presentation, it's really the municipalities that are the responders, and also where you see the policies being implemented. So I think part of the way we see this going is that, of course, you need to start with a kind of an endorsement and agreement on the government national level, but not stop there when there is space and appetite to really work on the local level. So the people who actually meet people fleeing and trying to do the risk prevention also can think about. Our colleagues come in, so I should stop.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, because I cannot, my microphone is not working. So I don't know.
It seems to be working now. So,
okay. Now, because I have a return, so I don't understand how it works. Because, wait, can you hear me nicely?
Yes, perfectly. Yeah, perfectly. Loud and clear.
Wait. Sorry, Hello?
Hello, Benedetta, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. No, because I had problems with the microphone. So, as Nina said, we are in process of developing the guidelines. The guideline will be, sorry, because I have a return, and I don't know why. It's quite disturbing me. Wait, I don't know.
Maybe you can turn the volume down on your computer because we can hear you without any feedback.
Hello?
Hello, Benedetta, we can hear you.
So now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what was going on with this computer. So as I said, we are in process of aligning the disaster displacement guidelines with the other national guidelines on disaster management. So the focus areas will be mainly to look at response, early warning and early action. So that one are the ones that, I mean, the guidelines will be in line with the provisions that we are developing with the other guidelines, the other national guidelines, because actually the country is developing 23 national guidelines and they are quite operational. So when I say guidelines, in reality, it talks about operational provisions. So that is because they have a very good legislation, but they don't have operational measure. So the country decided not to look much at prevention, because they said that prevention is also very much linked to climate change and other areas where they are not really involved as NDMC, because the mandate of climate change is the Department of Environment. But they said, but definitely, I mean, this one doesn't mean that they don't want to prevent, but they will be looking, the focus will be on response and early warning and early action. So that one will be the main focus areas. And also they agree also to look at the most vulnerable people, so to pay particular attention to the most vulnerable people more exposed to displacement. So this one is the approach that the country is taking. And I also would like to highlight that is quite good for South Africa, because South Africa didn't sign the Kampala Convention on internal displacement, and the fact that now they are committed to develop these guidelines is quite an achievement, we can say. And also it's an entry point for all the other departments that in a way are responsible for managing displacement. So yes, as I said, the Department of Environment, the Department of Social Departments, the public infrastructure, we can say the other departments who play a role in managing displacement is an entry point for asking accountability. So it's very good that the National Disaster Management Center accepted to and is very committed to develop these national guidelines, because in a way will also create horizontal and vertical accountability on how displacement is managed. So
thank you for this. Thanks for highlighting that, and I think it really complements nicely what also Nina was highlighting about the need to go down at the local level with the implementation of this measure. So it's basically a whole of government approach, all of society, even better. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, maybe just to sorry, just to add to local level, because the national guidelines will provide a standard, minimum standard operational guidelines to province and local government. So as you said, it's also a way of creating accountability. That is it's that's a standard that is for the whole South Africa, because also South Africa is very diverse, is very big, and that one is the scope also to create a system where even the province and the local government must be accountable to this standard and how they at local level they implement the national guidelines. So yes.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that really fits nicely with what we were hearing from Ms. Brewer about this idea of having predictable, consistent responses really across levels. And as Nina was saying, with the whole of society approach on this. We have two questions. The first one is to Achala and UNHCR. Does Achala know whether this experience, the experience of Cox's Bazar, will be discussed next week at the Global Refugee Forum? This is from Atle. And the second one from Heather will be, how are those local measures linked to and maximizing existing and planned emergency response approaches? The question is actually from Corey at IFRC. So the first one is to Achala, whether the Cox's Bazar case will be presented at the Global Refugee Forum. And the second one, as I'm assuming will be for Nina or for Benedetta, in terms of how are local measures linked to existing and planned emergency response approaches.
Hi, Lorenzo. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Oh, finally, it's working well. Yeah, so yes, we are presenting at the Global and we will be presenting it there. It will not focus where the way we presented today, in the sense of the broader disaster displacement and the local measures. It will focus mostly on the extension of the Bangladeshi national early warning system into the camp, and the inclusion of the refugees in the national system. So that's that's the main kind of focus at the Global Refugee Forum at this point. To go back to the question on lessons learned that you raised earlier, we do plan to document lessons learned, in the sense of we have a number of lessons learned, and then UNDRR is documenting the lessons learned as well on what are the best practices that can be taken forward. And CPP, Cyclone Preparedness Program, has been taken as one. And I think, again, this comes down to the what are the global best practices that the national governments can take in terms of refugee situations. How can those situations, how can the national disaster management systems be extended and expanded to those populations? So that's kind of the main area that we've been focusing on. But on a broader level,
Achala, we lost you, unfortunately. Okay, so maybe we can then move to the second question, and then we'll reconnect later. So if I can ask maybe Benedetta to start addressing the second question that came in, it was about how are local measures linked to existing and planned emergency response approaches, and then maybe I will ask Nina to complement that. Benedetta, are you still online?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so at local level, we in South Africa, I will refer to South Africa, but also I'm working at SADC level, so I know even from other countries. In terms of local measure response and also from a government point of view, the problem is that many of the disaster risk management strategy, even at local level or response operational plan, they don't really have a provision on displacement. They refer to evacuation, as Anne said. What I experience is that even the local government at local level, when there is a disaster, they refer to the disaster risk management strategy because they have to refer to that one. It's a formal document that they are accountable to, or even local government response plan, etc., etc. But the problem is exactly these ones, and there are no in details or rights or a rights approach based conceptual framework. So that means that they just refer to evacuation, but there is no any other provision. And that one is also why we have gaps. And also it's a reason why even the local government sometimes is not even able to implement or to prevent or to early act because there is no provision. The national, for example, in South Africa, the national guidelines wants to address these gaps because clearly there are different stakeholders. When a disaster happens, there are different stakeholders from UN, Oxfam coming in and saying to the government, you need to manage in this way, you need to do that one, you need to do this one. But then the local government in reality should be accountable to his plan, to its own emergency response plan. And unfortunately, it's where you have the gaps because the majority of the response plans, they talk about evacuation or they talk about, protection in general, but they don't have specific provision and probably not a fully understanding of displacement or on what displacement means. And then, and since displacement also involve the other departments, other actors within the government, sometimes even the risk governance doesn't allow, is not structured in a way that displacement can be really managed in a proper, we can say in a proper way. So like in South Africa, we want to really address these gaps. So, yeah, so even the local measure when there is a disaster is really based on what the stakeholder offer. We can say, I mean, but there is no really leadership from the government. So,
okay, thank you, Benedetta, for that.
Yes, we saw, like, just to say, we saw it in the Hidai and Kennet. That definitely the local municipalities, they were not ready, and they didn't have a plan, they didn't have a direction, and this one created also confusion on on how to manage displacement.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nina. And
yeah, no, I think what Benedetta really highlights is that if displacement isn't specifically thought of, neither as a risk nor as there will be specific needs displaced people have in hazard and disaster situation, then how can you address it? So what is different and specific for displaced people versus all the affected people? So I think this is one of the issues. Another thing which is a little bit more, as Benny also talks about, the formalities. I think a lot of the planning that exists on the local level hasn't necessarily been updated after the Sendai framework came in place. They're still built on what was in the Hyogo framework. So I think it's not necessarily an unwillingness to do this, but it takes time from things that are discussed on a global level to really integrate on a local level. And this is again why, as is planned in South Africa, doing training capacity building on the local level is so important. And also I know that UNDR will also integrate disaster displacement much more in the training capacity building they do with governments also on local level. So I think this is kind of a process moving forward. It won't be in place in 2020, but it started, and I think it's very much about acknowledging and not necessarily thinking that it's not there, but how do you integrate it in what's already there without waiting for it to be fully spelled out in words. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And Corey, we hope this addresses your question. We have another one from Nadine, and this is again from Achala, hoping that the connection works this time. And it's about the preparedness program in Cox's Bazar. The question being whether the program had any positive impact that were not originally foreseen in the planning stage. So I guess beyond the aspect solely linked to actually disaster preparedness. Actually, are you still online?
Lorenzo, you can hear me? Okay, perfect. So yeah, yes, there were many originally not foreseen. Hi, hello.
We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there were many positive impacts that came on at the initial stages when we extended the cyclone preparedness program. It was intended to be only for early warning. Then as time went, it was also the extension of the national disaster management system. So with that came in the response capacity of these volunteers as well as each of the camps. So then that has resulted now in this conversation of having these disaster management units for each of the camps, which we almost see as small neighborhoods of a larger city. And then now what is happening is the conversation on disaster management committees, which is very similar to how the national system in Bangladesh works, where we have the district level disaster management committees, the sub-district, and then at the local level. So similarly, we see similar approach coming because the government felt very comfortable with what was happening. They felt the ownership, and then now we are able to kind of expand that while the administrative system has been expanded to all 34 camps through the refugee repatriation. So if the camp in charge is in charge of a disaster management committee with another number of stakeholders, then it almost kind of represents what happens at the Bangladeshi national level disaster management system. So those are the unforeseen, like, positive impacts that we see coming. On top of that, I think the other aspect was we never thought this would be such a big multi-agency engagement. And what happened was, when we started this engagement and the ministry with the Bangladesh Red Crescent said to extend the program, what we saw was various agencies started joining this effort. So what started with maybe one or two organizations has become much bigger, almost a 25 to 30 multi-agency because it's not just one institution that is doing this anymore.
Thank you very much for that. We have another question that relates to the extent to which the Words into Action guideline will be advertised or introduced to governments in upcoming UNDRR events, so regional disaster risk reduction platform next year and in 2021. I defer that to Nina.
Yeah, no, and I'm not working with UNDRR, we're just working together with them. So I think they are the best to respond to this. But I think with these regional platforms, and for those who are not too much into the DRR world, UNDRR organizes regional platforms that are kind of preparation process for a global platform, but also discussion of what are the regional key issues. And what we saw in the last round, so 2 years ago, was that in all of these, there was some kind of event, either side event or in the official program, where disaster displacement and these guidelines were mentioned. I think we shouldn't have less the next time, but it's not going to happen by itself. So I think it's important that all of us on this call, whether we represent governments, UN, NGOs, etc., try to push for it in all the regional platforms where we are part, to make sure that it's on the agenda. And we at NRC, and I'm sure our colleagues at PDD, the Platform Disaster Displacement, will be very keen to help coordinate this. So as then both governments and UNDR start to prepare for these platforms, let's try to make sure that we get it on the agenda. The two platforms coming up in 2020, one covering Asia Pacific and the other one covering Americas and the Caribbean. They're both in the June, July next year. So it's still some time, but not much time. So anyone want to be part of pushing this, let us at NRC or also colleagues at PDD know, and we do it together.
So we got our action points out of this call. If there is no further question, I would like first thank you everyone for the discussion and for attending this webinar. And then I would invite Atle Solberg, who works with the Secretariat of the Platform Disaster Displacement, to provide some concluding remarks. Atle, if you're online, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, thank you so much. I've been asked to say a few words, and I have five points I just wanted to share with you, and maybe the first one is to congratulate the GP20 for organizing this webinar, and also to put disaster displacement on their agenda. We are very happy to see that. When I was listening to you earlier, Lorenzo, I was recalling the prep comps before the Sendai framework, and you remember this very well. That I remember you spent almost every night there looking at or watching and listening to the negotiation and making sure that mobility, migration, and displacement actually made into the text. And in that context, I think we have gone a long way, and a lot of progress has been made in sense of talking about displacement in the context of disaster risk reduction. And as you explained earlier on, the Sendai framework has a set of important consideration that we can work on. And I think I'm mentioning this because I think it was really a partnership efforts to make the Sendai framework as strong as it became, and also the partnership around developing the words into action. And it's always dangerous to start to list partners, but I think the UNDRR IOM, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Red Cross International Federation, NRC, governments in particular, should all be congratulated for the efforts made in the Sendai framework, then consequently in developing the Words into Action guide, and then also to remind ourselves that we are still not there. There are still a long way to go to reach, for example, target E of the Sendai framework in terms of having new strategies and policies in place that are aligned with the Sendai framework and are or do have displacement and mobility considerations. I think we still have a lot to do, and there are also some way to go from the target B, and that's why the regional platform next year will be important. In 2022, that will be halfway towards 2030, and the applicability or the validity of the Sendai framework in time. So we are almost halfway into the timeline of the Sendai framework, and that suggests we still have a lot to do. A second point I wanted to highlight is I do think that the Words into Action guidelines on disaster displacement is an increasingly important tool. I think we are reaching in many places what I would call the limit of disaster risk reduction, resilience, and adaptation, primarily because of climate change and adverse effect of climate change. And we need tools to manage those situations that also result in displacement. I think we unfortunately will see more displacement and we will see more loss and damage related to natural hazards. So there are two things we need to do. One is, of course, to try to reduce the impact of the hazard or reduce the hazards themselves, but we also have to prepare for a much more complicated future, unless we are really able to scale up our emissions on greenhouse gas emission, for example. So that was my second point. My third point is a bit related to this, and I think what we have seen together with UNDRR and NRC in some of the first attempts to roll out the Words into Action is that it's important to get this issue also out of the shadow of the disaster risk reduction. And please try to understand that I'm saying this in a constructive way, that by shadow of disaster risk reduction is the point that this issue is much larger than disaster risk reduction. And we really need to bring the system, the development tools into our work. And sometimes we talk about the nexus between humanitarian work and development work. I think when we talk about disaster displacement, it's an artificial distinction. It's both. It's both a humanitarian issue and also a development issue. And really, we have to get the disaster risk managers, disaster risk management policies and strategy to include the challenges of displacement and mobility, but we also need to bring this into the larger development program and strategies of countries. Otherwise, we will not be able to avert, minimize, and address this to a level that is acceptable. And then that brings me maybe to my first point, which is to congratulate South Africa. I think that is very encouraging what we hear. And I think what we heard from Anne is that they have done this. They have brought displacement and disaster displacement out of the shadow of DRR and brought it more into the larger policies around development. So I want to congratulate that. I also think that Achala and the American Red Cross should be congratulated. That was very, very good. And I like really the comprehensiveness and how camp work is actually embedded or aligned with national processes. And it's important to use the opportunity of what we see from Cox's Bazar in South Africa and other places to scale up our work. And then maybe my fifth and last point, back to the GP20 and also reminding everyone that there has been a high-level panel on internal displacement just constituted. They will be working for the next 12 months, and it's it is very important that we bring the issue of disaster displacement also to the attention of the high-level panel, and that we bring in all the gaps that we still see around preparedness, data, policies, and capacity to respond to some of these hazards. So maybe the fifth point was a call for action or call for joint and coordinated advocacy around the high-level panel. And maybe we can go back to some of the spirit we had in the PrepCom for the Sendai framework, and also in Sendai itself, where we work together a range of stakeholders, including states, to make sure that the text of the Sendai framework is as strong as it is. And we can see now in hindsight how important it is to have a global framework that has such language in it. So these are some points of summary from my side, or some comments in my own capacity. And again, thank you so much for organizing this and for inviting us. So over to you, Lorenzo.